Welcome to Cinema Convos. This is the show where we bring guests with different tastes in film to have a meaningful discussion about the art of cinema. I'm your host, Yash, and I'm here with our special guest, Arsal. Today, we're discussing the film The Shining from 1980, which was directed by Stanley Kubrick and written by Stanley Kubrick and Diane Johnson. And it was starring Jack Nicholson, Shelley Duvall, and Danny Lloyd. And in The Shining, a family heads to an isolated hotel for the winter where a sinister presence influences the father into violence, while his psychic son sees horrific forebodings from both past and future. And before we get started today, I wanted to issue a quick spoiler warning for The Shining. If you have not seen the film, we recommend checking it out before listening to this episode. And also, before we get started, I wanted to mention our guest Arsal is part of his own podcast called Controller Cast, and I wanted to give him an opportunity to talk about it and let us know what it's all about.
Yeah, hey, how's it going, everyone? Really, excited to be on here. Me and Yash have been talking about this for a few months, actually. But yeah, Controller Cast is kind of all about different pop culture events, as well as different movies, games, TV shows, top fives. We kind of cover a bunch of different things. Movies are obviously a big part of it, but we also just talk about, maybe if there's a new movie coming out, like we just reviewed The Batman, great film.
So good.
I know. Great film. Yeah. Not as good as The Dark Knight, I don't think.
Oh, absolutely not.
Yeah. But I think I like Rises a little bit better too, honestly. But
I'm a diehard Nolan trilogy fan, so for me, those are always the Batman movies to beat, and it might never happen. But it was very good. It's still very good.
Yeah. I think I did like it a little bit better than Batman Begins. But anyways,
that's fair. That's fair.
Yeah, but yeah, we talk about things that are old. We talk about things that are new. It's really kind of just what interests us. I think we're gonna try to have Yash on the show as a special guest coming up soon, try to find a topic that we all enjoy.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I think definitely check it out. I think the main kind of driving interest is just the three co-hosts, all three of us, me, Andrew, and John, kind of our interactions with each other, but also just, I think there's something for everyone in that show. We kind of talk about a wide range of topics.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I listened to a few episodes and I love how the variety of topics you guys cover. It feels very interesting and casual. Like you guys are just talking about what you guys have been watching and what you guys have been doing. And I think it's a lot of fun to listen to. So definitely check out Controller Cast if you're listening to this episode. Well, we'll get started with our discussion now, and we'll start with our preliminary questions to get the ball rolling. So what's your first memory or best memory with this movie?
Yeah, so first memory, I did see this movie when I was super young. It was just something that was on TV, and I was like 10 or 12, and it completely just bounced off my head. But then around, I think 2019, 2020, I sat down and gave it a rewatch because I feel like specifically with A24, horror has been kind of going through a bit of a renaissance lately. So I was interested in seeing The Shining because I think Stanley Kubrick was so ahead of his time in so many different genres. And that's when I rewatched it. I was just blown away by it. And I actually think my favorite memory, and it kind of to me also an indicator of the quality of this film is, my family hates horror films. They just think they're dumb. But when they came out last summer, my brother was looking at he wanted to watch a horror film. So I was like, let's watch The Shining. And, slowly within the first 30 minutes, my entire family just kind of sat down and they were just glued to the screen. Everyone was just sitting there in the living room in my apartment, just watching this movie. And, we all loved it. I think it's aged really well. And I think there's so much DNA in this film that carries over to so much modern horror. I think it's been, it's one of the most influential films of all time. And it has become, just in the past couple of years, one of my favorites. And I think it's my favorite Stanley Kubrick film. And I think it's probably the best horror film ever made, which is funny because that was definitely not its reception when it first came out.
Red rum. 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 Stop it. Red rum. Red rum.
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot of interesting topics with how this film is aged and how it first came out. And for my experience with this film, so 2017 was the year the first time I saw a horror movie was Get Out, Jordan Peele's Get Out in theaters.
Yeah,
And
also great film.
before I saw that, I genuinely also was the same way. Like, oh, horror movies are dumb. I don't think I would enjoy myself. I would just be scared the whole time.
Same.
But watching Get Out kind of opened my eyes that, okay, maybe there's something here. If I just avoid like the garbage, it's like the jump scare fest, and just like look for the good, creepy, like genuinely kind of unsettling psychological horror films, I would be more open-minded to watching them. And I think it was October of 2017. For one of my organizations, we had like a Halloween movie night, and my friend had recommended The Shining. So that's the first time I watched it, and up until like this week, the only time I had watched it. So I had to rewatch it because I had forgotten a lot of the things about it. And I actually have a copy of this movie because I bought like a Stanley Kubrick collection, which has The Shining, Clockwork Orange in 2001. It was like less than $20, so like I picked that up. And my favorite time watching was probably this week, just because I was like, oh wait, this actually, like, the movie does not make sense 100% no matter who you are. But you pick up on a lot of like foreshadowing and all these things when you watch it again. And for me, this isn't like one of my like all-time favorite movies, but I think it's one of the most influential movies ever made, and it's definitely worth talking about. I think that's true for a lot of Stanley Kubrick films. But yeah,
and I think like and I mean, I was kind of in the same boat with you, like how you're saying Get Out was kind of like your moment of like, yeah, horror films are stupid. Kind of like I was not a horror film someone that seeked them out really, but I kind of had that moment with like Hereditary. I don't know if you've seen Hereditary, but
I had like an A24 horror film like marathon once I started watching horror movies, so I've seen most of their major ones at least a few times.
Yeah, and that's kind of like when I started, because I don't like the jump scare, type horror films. I do like when there's kind of that psychological dread, that's kind of creeping throughout the whole film, and it's not necessarily like, oh, like this ghost is going to pop out the corner and like scare you. And that's kind of where I was like, okay, there's some depth and there's some substance to this genre. And that's where, and specifically, with like A24 horror movies, like I think there is a lot of DNA that kind of does run back to The Shining. I'm sure you probably picked up on that too with some of the shots and just the overall feeling of the film and the subject matter as well.
I mean, for me, like this movie, I think it just creates that feeling of like isolation that's like very uncomfortable. And from the get-go, you're like, these three people are alone, weird things are happening, and that's already like enough to make me like uncomfortable throughout. But also there's like a lot to analyze. I mean, the movie's never 100% clear about what's going on, and I feel like one of my favorite aspects about it is just how the atmosphere is very creepy. And it's like, I think I like that in movies more. I like when they're more creepy than scary. Like I'm just not comfortable. But I always wanted to ask you, like, what are some of your favorite aspects of the film?
Yeah, I think definitely one of them is kind of the mythos, maybe not directly the film itself, but the mythos surrounding the whole film. I remember making this meme like last year when I kind of rewatched it, where it's just like, do you remember those memes where it was like, it's kind of that line of like a movie. It's like, oh, like halfway through the line, it's like, oh my God, this is amazing. And before that line, it's like, it's okay. I don't know.
I think so. Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I just made this meme, but the line kind of went outside of the film's photo. And it was just like, this movie really sticks with you. And it's really, it's something I feel like if you're really into it and you really love it, you don't really realize it until after you've watched it, and you kind of like let it marinate with you for a little bit. But I think definitely one of the best parts of the film is everyone's performance. Even the kid. I know a lot of people, and Shelley Duvall, like I know a lot of people that have criticisms of this movie, they tend to point towards those two actors and the quality of their performance, but I think they're all fantastic. And I do love the ambiguity of a lot of it, because I think there's a lot of ways you can read the events of this film. I know there's people who like take, what's going on in this film, and you could, some people will say like, oh, it's just cabin fever, like the dude is just losing his mind. But then, there's other interpretations. Maybe he's like a reincarnation of a previous, caretaker of the residency. Because, kind of like the photo at the end of the film, like it shows in 1921, I believe, or it's like 100 years from now. That like a photo of all of them in it. Like my kind of reading of the film is, to some extent, the hotel has some sort of presence and it's alive, like that iconic shot of the The blood coming out of the elevator, that's one of my favorite shots in cinema. It kind
Yeah.
of shows that this like a living almost creature, like of a hotel, and maybe whenever whoever gets succumbed to it or falls ill to it, that's on that photo at the end to me is almost like a catalog of like everyone that's kind of been taken over by this hotel, and they kind of get put into that picture. That's kind of like my own personal interpretation of it, but I've seen so many different interpretations, and I think that shows like the depth of this film. This movie is a rabbit hole, honestly, of discussion.
Yeah, if you go on the YouTube rabbit hole of seeing interpretations of this movie, there's so many.
Mr. Grady, you were the caretaker here.
I'm sorry to differ with you, sir. But you are the caretaker. You've always been the caretaker. I should know, sir. I've always been here.
But I think for me, it's definitely like whoever comes to stay in this hotel, they're pretty much like possessed and like murder their family. Like that's basically what happens. But just to follow up on a couple of things you said, I think Jack Nicholson is really good in this movie, but I do feel like I'm one of those people who has the criticisms about Shelley Duvall. I don't know, some of the ways she says certain dialogue, I feel like maybe it's intentionally supposed to be kind of off and weird, but like I feel like Jack Nicholson is like by far like the best actor in this movie.
But
I wouldn't go as far to say like the acting is bad from like Shelley Duvall and the kid, but I don't know. I think it's very strange. Like maybe it's intentionally strange because I know Kubrick is like a perfectionist. He was a perfectionist, so like I can only imagine how many takes they had of like different scenes.
I think the iconic like give me the I'm not gonna hurt you, I'm gonna bash your brains. Like I think that like I don't know if it does anymore, but I think it held a record for like amount of takes that they had to go back, and it's a long shot, like going through that whole room. I think they had to do it like 125 times or something like that.
But in terms of both Jack Nicholson and the directing and cinematography of this movie, it's really well done, and it's enough to carry the movie for anything that's lacking maybe on any other performance. But also I wanted to mention, you mentioned like the blood coming out of the hotel doors. I think this movie actually reminds me a little bit of Parasite because the hotel itself feels like a character. Like the house in Parasite's like a character. Like it's very much alive, just as alive as any of the characters in the movie. I think that's really unique because I haven't visited this hotel in real life. My friend Zach, who actually co-hosts the show with me, said he's been.
I have as well.
I feel like I'd be just like scared to go there. Like what's going to happen to me if I'm in this hotel?
Well, there's been a town that's been like built around the hotel now, so it definitely doesn't have that like that isolating feel to it. But I've had friends go there that are super into like paranormal. I mean, John, one of the hosts of the show, he's like super into like supernatural stuff like that, and he felt like that there was some sort of like quote unquote presence there. He like felt off. So it's interesting how people can have those sorts of experiences, especially like even in the real life hotel, like the room 2. I think in the movie it's 237, but in the book it's like 267, something like that. That's like one of the most popular rooms to rent. Like you have to like rent it like years in or book it like years in advance. It's crazy.
I would never stay in there. Just couldn't do it. There's a limit to my horror interest. But speaking of the book, I have never read it, but I know like Stephen King like famously hated this movie. I'm curious if you know more about that or if you like read the book or anything like that.
No, I haven't read the book, but one of my closest friends, she has, and it's interesting because Stephen King, like very like infamously does not like
he like despises this movie.
He despises the movie, but both in their own respect, are regarded as some of the greatest pieces of their respective medium.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it comes back to like when you're making a movie about something that's based on a book, it doesn't have to match the book to be good, right? Because I'll give an example of this. I have a few examples about this topic actually that I wanted to bring up. Like looking at the Harry Potter movies, I think they did an exceptional job adapting the books. They took the most important part of these like super long, bulky books and like made movies out of them. And any criticisms you might have, I mean, the heart and the soul of the story are still there. The characters feel well represented. And kind of the flip side of that has been the Fantastic Beasts movies, which like I don't think they're bad because I'm like a diehard Harry Potter fan. but like I think it comes down to like screenwriting is not the same thing as like book writing. Because like J.K. Rowling, when you read the Harry Potter books, they're very descriptive, right? There's like a lot of details, a lot of like lore and stuff. But when you're writing a script, it needs to be like you need to get to the point fast. You know, you got to like you have to move at a good pace. And I feel like she's writing in the same style that she wrote the books. She's writing these scripts, and that's why the movies feel kind of clunky when you watch them.
Yeah, I mean that's an amazing example. And I mean, I would use another example. I mean, just from one of the episodes I watched, you talking about it, like taking inspiration or adapting something, like even like the Dark Knight trilogy. Like that is very much Nolan's interpretation of those characters and things, and it's amazing. But is it like the most faithful to the comics? No. It really does come down to, at the end of the day, I think, execution. When you are writing a script, a screenplay, there's so many more things you have to consider, like pacing and there's so many more aspects to consider because it's a visual medium as opposed to something you're just reading.
Dialogue plays a much bigger part in films, just because in the book you can get inside the character's head. I have another Stephen King example for this. I mean, I like both. I read Misery before I watched the film, and they're completely different, but they're both great in their own ways. I mean, the book is like explores the inner turmoil of this guy like trapped in a bad situation, and the movie is just like a straight up thriller, and both are like excellent for what they set out to do. So I feel like when you're adapting a story, I don't know how Stephen King feels about the Misery movie, because that's also like an Oscar-winning movie. But yeah, I think it's interesting because a very similar famous situation was another Jack Nicholson film, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. The author like hates the movie for that. So it's maybe it's like Jack Nicholson in the 80s was just very, very bold in his film choices. But
yeah, like it's interesting some of the differences that Stephen King doesn't. I've seen him point out that he takes issue with, or some of the reasons that I like really enjoyed this movie more. Two examples that just come off the top of my head are, in the novel, Shelley Duvall's character, Wendy Torrance, she's kind of like really this well put together, beautiful woman that's just she just has her shit together. She knows what to do in like any situation. I kind of really like that in the film. Wendy is a lot more just like an average person that just caught in this like a terrible circumstance, doesn't know what to do. Another example is Jack Torrance in the book. His descent to madness is very progressive, and it's very slow. And like at the beginning of the movie, he's a family man and he's this great guy. But in the movie, I mean, right off the bat, like he's kind of creepy from the start, and that even opens up to me like interpretation. Like, has this guy been kind of a bad man before the events of this movie?
Watching it again, it's like I realized like even before he becomes like a murderous like axe wielding like maniac, he's kind of a bad dude. Like he's really mean to his wife, and I don't know if it's like because he's becoming possessed or like. But when she comes into his room while he's writing and he's like, "You interrupted my thought process," it's like, dude, you're being so harsh to this woman. Like, and then they talk about how like he accidentally hit his son, or like he used to be like an alcoholic. Like all these things come up, and you notice them more when you watch it again.
Yeah.
And the whole first act is just like pure foreshadowing. Like, oh, there was a murder here at one point, and like all these things that like come into play later. So I really enjoyed watching it again and seeing those like almost hints about what's about to go down.
And speaking of like foreshadowing, like there's so many just small details, like you said, like Kubrick is like a perfectionist early on in the movie. Like if you actually pay attention to like the floor plan and like how they walk around and things like that in the building, when he goes into for that interview at the beginning of the movie, it's like a windowed room. There's a window behind the guy that's interviewing him. But if you like pay attention to the floor plan, it's like that room is like in the middle of the hotel. Like it's impossible for there to have been like a window, looking out into the outside of the building and things like that.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack in this movie, and I was watching one of those like ending explained videos on YouTube, and one of the comments was just like, I think the best way to understand The Shining is just to admit you don't understand it, and like that's okay. Like I totally feel that.
Hello, Danny. Come and play with us.
There's a lot of movies that I don't think are meant to be understood in like one way, and I think this is definitely one of them. And I would say I liked it more watching it again. And so I think it's one of those movies I just need to watch again and again, because I know there are some films I don't necessarily like that much the first time, then I watch it again and I'm like, most of Chris Nolan's library is like that. That I like it more the second time.
Yeah, I think with like things that are open to interpretation, I think and there's a movie that I really don't like, but it really made me learn this lesson about like ambiguity in films. Is this movie called I'm thinking of ending things, I think.
I hated that movie.
Yeah, I hated that movie, and I think the reason is like I like when movies are have some sort of ambiguity. I think it adds more depth to it. But I think you need to have some sort of basis of reality or some sort of basis of like something to latch onto to lead into that. And like like a movie like that's like ambiguous.
Yeah,
throughout the whole film, there's nothing to latch
I'm
onto.
glad you brought it up, because
Yeah.
for months I've seen people just praising that movie, and I was like,
No, I
why?
don't get it.
It's it doesn't make sense. It's boring. It's like ambiguity is an art form in its own. Like you can have some ambiguity, but if the entire film is just ambiguous, it might not be entertaining. Like it might not have any, like, I don't know. That's I do criticize a lot of films for like being too ambiguous for my taste, but there are those films that hit the right level of like, okay, I know, in like there was that film Annihilation.
Yeah.
Like I couldn't tell you what's happening in the last 20 minutes or so, but like
Yeah.
there was enough, I had enough basis of like the plot to like follow it and like understand some of it, right?
Mhm.
I think that's a level of ambiguity that I like. But you're totally right. I didn't like I'm Thinking of Ending Things. And there was another movie called, it was A24 film. I'll probably get some heat for this, but there was one movie with Joaquin Phoenix, You Were Never Really Here, or something like that.
I haven't seen that, but I feel like I've heard good things about it. Is it not
Yeah.
good?
I mean, I dislike it for the same reasons I disliked like I'm Thinking of Ending Things. So definitely watch it, form your own opinion. But to me, that was also another ambiguous movie that I felt like didn't really do much for me.
Mhm.
That's one of my super hot takes. I mean, there's not very many of those.
Yeah, I need to think of some of my own hot takes.
You watch enough films, you'll have them. I mean, so yeah, you mentioned that you said this is the best horror film, or like at least one of the best. What are some other
Yeah.
horror films that you like besides this one that like stand out to you? And I'll share some of mine as well.
Yeah. So I think the reason I kind of come to that conclusion, which I do think it's like the best horror film, is I think it just aged super well. And like when I watch so many horror films today, they just carry that all roads like lead back to The Shining, quote unquote. But I think this is my favorite. I have to say Hereditary. Hereditary is fantastic. That scene,
Dude,
anyone that's seen-
I watched Ari Aster's like 30-minute short film. That thing is messed up, dude. It's called like The Strange Things About the Johnsons. Have you seen that?
No, but I've seen some of his other short films like around that time, and they're just they're super weird.
Messed up.
Yeah.
I mean, I was just curious because it was on YouTube, and I was like, oh god, I'm traumatized.
Yeah, I've seen some of his on YouTube. They're
Yeah.
super weird. You would never think
Yeah.
like that guy would end up directing something like Hereditary. And his next movie actually I think has Joaquin Phoenix in it.
The next one.
I think it's called like Disappointment Boulevard.
Well, I saw that Ari Aster wants to like try other genres besides horror not too long ago. So it's
yeah,
interesting.
I mean, I'd be interested to see that because I guess this is a hot take. I really didn't like Midsummer.
Okay. I know Fawad hates that movie too, though.
Yeah, we and him have talked about
I like
it.
it. I like it. But I think it's a little overhyped, but it's good.
So like with that movie, I like saw it in theaters, and by the end, everyone was like laughing in the theater. So it just kind of just
It's
took me out of
weird.
it.
It's a bizarre movie. I watched it with my brother, and we were watching it like in my game room, and I was like, I feel like my grandparents were like nearby, and I was like, all the sex stuff starts happening, and I'm like, oh god, like I hope they don't walk in right now. We have a lot of explaining to do.
Yeah,
that happens.
But besides Hereditary, I also really love The Lighthouse by Robert Eggers. I think that movie walks a very fine line in terms of like being too ambiguous.
Yeah, that was one of those films I thought was a little too ambiguous, but I still liked it. I didn't dislike it.
Yeah. I really like, this is gonna be a weird one. I really like The Strangers. I know that one's not like super critically acclaimed. But those are just some of the ones off the top of my head.
Well, I think it comes back to like, I think horror and comedy, like fear and laughter are so like subjective. Like you can't really look at reviews and like be like, oh, I'm gonna feel the same way about this movie.
Yeah.
There have been so many comedies that are like rotten on Rotten Tomatoes that are hilarious. Like,
yeah.
like We're the Millers is just one example. Like that's a really funny movie in my opinion, but it's all subjective. But also what people find scary is subjective too. So
yeah.
But when it comes to horror, I've done like I've watched all kinds of horror at this point. I mean, horror comedies, horror thrillers, even some like foreign horror films. Like it's funny because I've watched such a high variety of them, like in the just like 4 years. I don't know if I have a favorite. I'm a big fan of The Quiet Place, both 1 and 2.
Oh yeah, I completely forgot
But
about
those
that.
are almost more like thrillers. But
Yeah. I like 1 a lot more than 2. 2 was a little bit of a letdown for me.
yeah, I don't know which one I like more. I like them both for like different reasons. But looking through my horror list, because I keep track of this, because I'm actually watching this genre now.
Yeah,
Anything Stephen King, usually I'll watch. I've seen both the Carrie movies. I think they're both solid.
I really like it. It's not
Yeah,
the scariest film, but
it's good. I think it's pretty creepy. It Follows is really good. That's a good one.
yeah, It Follows is really good.
Psycho, one of my favorite films. Let's see. Anything A24 has made, I've probably seen it. Seen all the Scream movies, all the Final Destinations. Like,
have you seen Under the Skin?
not yet. I need to. It's on my list.
Yeah, I think that was the very first A24 movie like ever. That movie's, I don't know if it's a horror, but it's
Yeah, I heard it's very
interesting.
unique. It's one with Scarlett Johansson, right?
Yeah, very, probably her most unique role ever. It's
Okay.
I remember watching that when I was like 14, 15 and just being like, what the hell am I watching? Like,
Yeah. For sure. That's the thing. I was very easily scared as a kid, so that's why as an adult I avoided horror for a while.
Yeah, I remember that when I used to live in Tomball, like
Yeah.
we would always watch like horror movies at like Fawad or Beer's place, and I was
Yeah.
I'm like 3 years younger than them, so
Uh-huh.
or 3 years younger than like Fawad, so I was always the youngest kid, and everyone always tried to scare me watching all these movies.
That was the same with me. I mean, I was friends with Fawad, and all of our friends loved horror, and I was just like, please no, like,
Yeah.
like don't do this to me. But yeah, there's a wide variety. I'm a big fan of like the original Halloween. Like I love slashers. I like psychological thrillers if they're done right. That's usually the caveat for any horror movie, whether it's
if it's done right. Yeah.
like if it's like done right, it's good. But so many things, like the thing is, I watched this just to bring up slashers real quick. I watched the original Halloween with some friends recently, and I think that's a great movie considering how like low budget it is and like how it does so much with just like one musical score and directing and lighting. But everyone's like, well, we've seen so many movies like this. I'm like, yeah, but this is like one of the first that was like this. The reason you saw so many is because of this movie.
Yeah, and I mean, I think horror films are probably like, I mean, I've tried to make like screenplays and write short films, and like I definitely feel like horror is probably one of the hardest genres to make. Yeah, because you have to put so much trust in. Same with comedy, like you're just saying, horror and comedy, because there's so much of that you have to put into the reaction or like how the audience is going to feel about it.
Like you need a story, and then you also need like jokes or like scary moments like in your story, like scattered.
Yeah, you have to put some faith or trust into the audience, I think more so than any other genre.
Yeah, which is why they're usually, those two genres are very polarizing, just because people have different interpretations. Like the reason I bring Halloween up, because I think The Shining did for like psychological horror what Halloween did for like slashers. Like it just paved the way for so many other films and stories.
I heard the new ones are pretty good too.
The 2018 one was solid. The Halloween Kills was kind of bad, but it was I still had fun with it. Like it was like, I mean, what do you expect? It's like the 1,000th slasher movie they've made in history or something. Like, yeah,
my brother saw it. He said it's just like this dude, like just
the character
cannot be killed. Like he takes out the whole town.
Very dumb, and Michael Myers is just invincible at this point. Yeah, I think this movie definitely is very influential to this, especially like the A24 wave we're seeing. I mean, The Shining definitely plays a part in that, as we've already mentioned. But another thing I wanted to mention is that, funnily enough, after I saw this movie, not too long after I saw Ready Player One, which has like a whole Shining sequence. Yeah, and I was like, hey, I get that reference. I was like Captain America, but I think it plays into like how this movie has influenced pop culture so much. I know Zach wanted to mention the Treehouse of Horror episode of The Simpsons, which I've seen, but I've seen so many episodes of The Simpsons I don't really remember it. Yeah, and he said he wanted to mention that like he thinks it's one of the like best parodies he's ever seen. He used to watch it like every Halloween.
Yes, by cutting off cable TV and the beer supply, I can ensure an honest winter's work out of those lowlifes.
Sir, did you ever stop to think that maybe it was doing this that caused the previous caretakers to go insane and murder their families?
Perhaps. Tell you what, we come back and everyone's slaughtered, I owe you a Coke.
school's out. Think I'll have a beer. Not a drop in the house. What do you know?
Homer, I'm impressed. You're taking this quite well.
I'll kill you. I'll kill all of you.
Homer!
Sorry. Don't worry. There's plenty I can do to keep myself occupied. Maybe I'll check out that axe collection. See you later.
Mom, is Dad gonna kill us? We're just gonna have to wait and see.
Yeah,
There's so many moments from this movie that have become like part of like pop culture. Just the zeitgeist. I mean, like the icon. We haven't even talked about like the iconic "Here's Johnny." Like
yeah.
There's so many like iconic scenes.
Or like he's frozen in the ice. That's like a meme now. I forgot that was a meme.
Yeah, and it's so funny because I guess one thing I wanted to maybe talk about was like, I don't know if you've seen, but like when this movie first came out, it was just, I mean, it was considered a bad film. Yeah,
like there were bad reactions initially from what I've read about.
Yeah, it was like nominated for like a few different Razzies, which is insane. Like I think this movie more than any movie is like insane to see how the reception has completely changed. Because I mean, even like I see in 2018, the United States National Film Registry, like they inducted it into its like Hall of Fame for being culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant, which is like a lot. I can't even think of like a movie nowadays that'd be nominated for a Razzie and get into that spot.
It's interesting because I feel like it goes back to Kubrick just being like very experimental, because I did an episode with my friend for 2001, which is I feel kind of similarly about it. I don't necessarily like love the movie, but I can see why it's so influential and important. And he was telling me about like how when they premiered like the initial version of the film or something like that, they're like people were like walking out and things like that. So
that's a very slow movie.
I mean like it's a slow movie, but like that kind of thing I feel like happened to Kubrick a few times, just because he really pushed the boundaries, and whether you love or hate any of his movies, you're gonna watch something different. And I feel like the closest thing we have to that today is like Chris Nolan, just because he makes unique films. Like it doesn't always have to be good or
100%.
bad, but like they're always different, right? I feel like there's a lack of innovation in cinema nowadays, just because everything's a prequel, reboot, sequel, remake, whereas very few of those are like as good as whatever they're trying to emulate. The only example I can think of was that I actually liked the new West Side Story. I liked more than the original, but that's like the only example I can think of in like the last few years.
I think I really think Kubrick was so ahead of his time for a lot of his films, and like you said, like very experimental. I mean, like 2001, like it's probably like it should be in the conversation for some of the most important films of all time. I personally don't like love it. I think it's a great film.
I agree, it is pretty slow.
I think it's a great film, but like that's like a perfect example of like you would not believe that movie came out 50 years ago.
Like 1968. Like the special effects are so well thought out and they hold up so well.
And
that's the most impressive part for me for that film.
And I mean, I think he's probably, like, for me personally, I think he's probably in the conversation for like top 5 directors of all time, just because of like how ahead of the curve I feel like he was in so many regards. It sucks that he passed away like right after Eyes Wide Shut. But I think like you're saying like Nolan. I think Nolan is like definitely carrying that baton. I think recently Denis Villeneuve.
Denis Villeneuve.
He's been fantastic. I think he's definitely moving up there.
I think Prisoners is one of the best films I've seen in the last few years.
I absolutely love Prisoners. Blade Runner 2049.
Arrival is also by him. That's a great film too.
Sicario. The latest Dune. I personally think my favorite of his is either like Prisoners or
Arrival for me, probably my top 2. But I like all of his films that I've seen.
I would say probably Prisoners or Blade Runner 2049. I love that film as well. But I think both of those directors specifically are kind of really carrying that mantra or like that those ideas and aesthetics that Stanley Kubrick really laid down. And I mean, I'm really excited for obviously like Dune Part 2 and Oppenheimer, which every single day there's someone new added to the cast.
Is insanely massive for that. Like it's wild.
I just saw Josh Peck from like Drake and Josh.
Josh Peck is in the cast. I was pretty surprised to see that. Good for him. From Drake and Josh to a Nolan film.
And I'm excited for like Nolan particular, like to go back to something that seems a little more character driven. I feel like that was like kind of the one
Yeah.
thing missing with like his two most recent films.
But I feel like
Dunkirk and Tenet.
with his films, he's always doing a new genre. Like Tenet was a spy film, Dunkirk was a war film, Inception is like sci-fi, Dark Knight comic book movies. He's always like trying to do something new. Now he's doing like a biopic type of film, which probably will be like have his own take on it. Won't be a conventional biopic probably.
Mhm.
But
He'll
look,
probably do it out of chronological order.
oh yeah, the guy is obsessed with time. I mean, anyone who's seen any of his films. Oh yeah, I mean, Interstellar was like his space movie, and
Yeah.
I know he
Very
has a
inspired
lot
from
of.
2001.
He's even said like 2001 was a big inspiration for that film.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think with Stanley Kubrick, since my last Kubrick episode, I have watched like 3 or 4 of his films.
Yeah.
We did 2001 a little while back, but I will say my 2 favorite films from him are actually A Clockwork Orange and Full Metal Jacket. I think I think A Clockwork Orange I had avoided watching for a long time because I'm like this sounds more horrifying than like a horror movie. Like this, like I had heard about it. But I watched it and yeah, it was super weird and like disturbing, but it's brilliant. It's all about like what makes us human and like the free will of our thinking and all that kind of stuff. And it's also based on a book, funnily enough. But I don't remember anything about like the author like hating the movie or anything like that for that one.
Yeah.
Full Metal Jacket is insane. It's just it feels like 3 movies in one.
Yeah, that's kind of my main kind of gripe with it. I feel like the first half of the film is a lot stronger than the second half.
I would agree with you on that.
Yeah.
The first half is definitely the strongest.
Clockwork Orange, I feel like I need to do like a rewatch of because I saw that like it's like 6-7 years ago, and that's also like to me the one thing that movie was like lacking was I feel like that was a movie that's just like you're really expecting like some sort of twist at the end. I don't know why.
There's really no twist. It's just like, oh, this kind of sucks.
Yeah. I do love the ending shot of the film.
Yeah, and then I watched one of his films from the 50s, Paths of Glory, which is also a very good film.
Yeah, I want to watch Doctor
Strangelove. Yeah, I saw that one as well. To me, here's my thing with Doctor Strangelove. I don't think it's a bad movie or a great movie. I think it's one of those movies it's a satire of its time, right? It's made in the 60s.
Yeah.
And I feel like whenever I watch a movie that's an older satire.
Yeah.
I recently watched To Be or Not to Be, which is another satirical film from the 40s. I feel like when it's a satire about a different time period, it's hard to get in the same like headspace of like modern times.
Now then, Dimitri, you know how we've always talked about the possibility of something going wrong with the bomb. The bomb, Dimitri. The hydrogen bomb. Well, now, what happened is one of our base commanders, he had a sort of, he went a little funny in the head. Just a little funny. And he went and did a silly thing. Well, I'll tell you what he did. He ordered his planes to attack your country. Well, let me finish, Dimitri.
I feel like something like Don't Look Up is not going to age well.
Yeah, I saw on your episode you didn't like that film. I actually was one of the people who really liked it.
But
I can see why it's pretty in your face. So I understand some of the criticisms. But yeah, I think that's a good example. Like maybe in like 40 years, people won't be like, oh, like this is a great movie because like it's not really relevant to today's issues and things like that. But yeah, I've seen those 6 so far, and I think he only made like 13, 14 films total.
Yeah, Eyes Wide Shut. That's one I've also been really wanting to watch. I haven't gotten around to it.
I need to watch that because it's his last one, right? It's the last one he was able to do.
And Tom Cruise, it's like very interesting, like kind of role for Tom Cruise. I feel like.
Yeah, I know another director I've been watching a lot of his work recently is Paul Thomas Anderson.
Great
I think director. He makes some weird stuff too, but same thing. I feel like every film I watch from him is completely different. It's not.
He's There Will Be Blood, right?
There Will Be Blood, Boogie Nights.
I always get him confused with Wes Anderson.
Yeah, they're different for sure.
Yeah,
Wes
very
Anderson's
different.
The kooky like.
Yeah, I just saw Licorice Pizza. That was interesting.
Yeah, that was a weaker PTA in my opinion. I was a bigger fan of. I think Boogie Nights is my favorite from him.
There Will Be Blood is amazing. I think that's a fantastic.
I need to rewatch it because I feel like I watched that when I was quite young. Didn't really fully appreciate it, but I need to watch it again.
Yeah, Paul Dano. That was like his first big role. I feel like.
Paul Dano, I'm glad he's having his moment because he's been slept on for too long. He's such a good actor.
Yeah. He's always kind of played a second fiddle or like a very like strong supporting character.
Yeah.
I'm glad to see him kind of
I
get
recently
put in
watched
this.
I watched Little Miss Sunshine. He has a supporting role in that, and that's a really sweet and wholesome movie.
Mhm.
And young Paul Dano's in it before he's the Riddler.
Yeah, he's
So
always in some like weird, like kind of unsettling roles, like even like
yeah,
Prisoners.
that's kind of his like niche though. He has to
Yeah,
play like the weird guy. like
typecast.
like he doesn't talk
Typecast
in
as a
Little Miss
weirdo.
Sunshine, and he I'm pretty sure he was in 12 Years a Slave too. Like he's just always the weird, like kind of annoying guy, but he's so
Yeah,
captivating
he
to
is
watch.
in 12 Years a Slave. I forgot about that.
Something I didn't really notice the first time I watched it, but this movie has a really good score. I think it really like heightens a lot of the
Yeah,
tension. And
yeah.
I wanted to ask, like, do you feel like what do you want to say about the score in this film, and also like maybe scores in other horror films?
It's funny because it's not, the score is not even something that I would like kind of think of like off the top of my head when I'm thinking about this film, but I'm glad you mentioned it because like I love when scores really kind of have this build up to them. Like going back to Nolan, I know we keep talking about Nolan, but like specifically like The Dark Knight. I love the score in that film. That film almost has like a score of like a horror film at times where it's like this like
Yeah.
slow progressive build up,
Mm.
and I think that's a pretty common in horror films in general, where there's this like slow progressive buildup of this dread, that's kind of looming into the background. There's
Yeah.
not like a specific like piece that
Right.
like I'm going back to in this film, maybe like something like recent, like the Batman's like theme, but I think it's very additive as opposed to something that's like that takes over your experience, if that makes
Yeah,
sense.
it's never like you never need to have a great score to have a good movie, but it can make a good movie great almost if it's like done right.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so for sure, I think watching this scene, like I don't know, there'll be like a scene where like they're just people sitting in a room, but like the score makes it like terrifying because like it's like almost warning the audience that something's about to happen.
Here's Johnny.
Yeah, and specifically, I think like the two things that really carry over to modern horror films from this film are like I think the soundtrack, that is one, how the sound is used, but also I think specifically I think the cinematography in this film
Mhm.
is amazing.
Yeah, there's a lot of interest. Like I think the cinematography is done so well, and also like the shots are very well thought out. Like there's lots of just like looming shots of the hotel or like even just like the carpet or the walls, but like it's done in a way that just works really well for what the movie's trying to do.
Yeah, I love the long. It's a technique I've been seeing cropping up more and more. Specifically, it's used really well in like I don't know if you've seen Euphoria.
I
That
have all
yeah,
of it.
yeah. I mean, storytelling aside, I think like technically that show is also like amazingly used. But I love like kind of like the slow. There's a I don't know if there's a name for that specific shot, but like kind of the slow zoom in. Like a lot of Kubrick films did that, and it's like kind of been propping up a lot more in like horror films, but just A24 in general, kind of like that slow creeping pan in for it really gets you into the zone of that specific maybe thing that it's zooming in on. It really makes you focus on the imagery at hand.
Yeah, for sure. And it's I mean, I think the A24 films have definitely adapted that, like both the cinematography and also like just like the uncomfortable, almost quiet
Mhm.
but not quiet like sound design. But yeah, I think cinematography is a huge part of this film, aside from just sound design and acting. And I think it just creates an atmosphere really well. I've always said I like the horror movies that have a good atmosphere,
Yeah.
and
Mhm.
I think this is one of the ones that definitely has a really solid atmosphere
Yeah.
from the second it starts. You
Yeah.
know,
And
mhm.
that just kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier at the beginning. It was just like, that's what makes like great horror films. It's like you have this tension, this
Right,
atmosphere, this creepy atmosphere throughout the whole film, this
right.
unsettling feeling throughout, as opposed to a specific instances of horror where something pops out and scares you.
Right. It's like the tension. The perfect horror film for me has consistent tension and atmosphere, and also has like payoff. And I think this movie has both. Like, the payoff is him like chasing his son in like like the maze or whatever. That's the payoff moment. But the tension leading up to that is what makes it worthwhile.
Yeah.
I think Hereditary did that really well also, where like people are like being lit on fire and stuff, and like the end. But like the whole time I'm like, there's something wrong with this family. Like there's deeper things that are causing discomfort, and then like the supernatural stuff just makes it like worse.
Yeah, and that's kind of like I think it's funny that like this and Hereditary are like my two favorite like horror films because they have so many I feel like parallels where I think also like the subject matter of this film and Hereditary, what makes them so great is yeah, there's that unsettling presence or feeling throughout the whole film, but the heart of the film or the subject matter really is like this family collapsing on itself, you know, like the
Yeah.
issues, like you said, there's more to it.
Have you seen the film The Babadook?
Yeah, yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, that one also has like I feel like a lot of deeper themes going on.
Yeah, and I think probably like the best way to like sum it up is like, you know, you can't just have the supernatural. The supernatural I feel like has to be almost kind of be like the straw that breaks the camel's back. You know, there has to be issues kind of fundamentally like on a grounded level that people can relate to. You know, I think there's things that are relatable, like you know, like on a relationship level, probably like for people like you know, a marriage that isn't going right, you know, or like there's maybe issues with their son or, you know, things like that where there's things to latch onto that really connect you with the characters. And same thing with like Hereditary. You know?
For sure. Like, I mean, I know you didn't like it much, but like Midsummer, the whole thing's
Yeah.
about like a bad relationship, basically. Like,
Yeah.
and also dealing with like the tragedy of like her losing her family and beginning her, you know, that like I think
That's my favorite part of the movie is the beginning.
it gets pretty weird after that. But I think it's just like the horror movies that actually like focus on like the human nature of the characters are the ones that stand out. Like the supernatural stuff will happen, or like there'll be a monster, like a killer or whatever. But if you have a reason to care for the characters, you're gonna enjoy that stuff more. You're gonna feel more. There's more at stake.
Yeah,
that's the issue with
100%.
like modern slashers is that like, oh, there's gonna be
The
creative
characters are
kills.
dumb. Yeah.
It's like there's no reason to care about them. The killer's just gonna kill them all. Like, you know, there needs to be some tension where
They're
like
fodder essentially, right?
yeah, like there's so much focus on like the blood and gore. They forget that what makes the original Halloween so great is not because there's a high body count. It's that you feel the dread and like fear from like these characters' perspective, and because you actually like get to know them a little bit. So I think that's
you're
like,
behind what's the main the actress's name? I'm trying to remember.
Jamie Lee Curtis.
Yeah, exactly. You have something to latch onto.
Yeah, like you want her to survive the night. Like that should be at the bare minimum you should care about somebody.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, and I think that's the issue with the slasher genre. But when it comes to psychological horror, I think it's important to have some kind of like human emotion or theme present. I think The Shining has that with, you know, clearly it's a family on the rocks. They might be coming to this hotel to like try something different, change of pace, you know, maybe fix some of the issues they're having. So that kind of stuff is all definitely very present in the themes of this movie.
The one thing I want to say, like we kind of talk about like A24 movies. The one criticism I think I've kind of developed though from A24 films is they've been, I don't know if have you seen like The Witch? And
I have. We did a podcast on it.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So like if you take like The Witch, Hereditary, not Shining, Midsummer, and Lighthouse, right? And I think The Lighthouse is the most recent of all of those. You there's like a little bit of a pattern that's developed, I've noticed, between all four of them, where you have insert X amount of people into a situation, and those people start turning on each other. And
yeah, it's almost like a formula.
And pretty much one person survives at the end, and that one person kind of succumbs to whatever the thing is that's kind of like looming over them throughout the whole film. Like every one of them, like when I went to go see The Lighthouse, I said this exact thing. I was like, I bet this is what's going to happen. And that is exactly what happened. You know, I still love the movie, but I was just like, there's a bit of a pattern that's formulating.
For sure. So I guess I wanted to ask you, you know, you mentioned a lot about different aspects you like about this movie, but I wanted to ask you, do you have like a favorite scene in the movie?
Yeah. So, I mean, in general, probably my favorite scene is that scene where, you know, Jack is kind of just following Wendy throughout that big open area, you know, and they're that long shot. There's a kind of a scene within that scene where Wendy's like, you know, I think we should take Danny to a doctor, you know, or no, I think we should talk about Danny. And then Jack is like, yeah, I think we should talk about Danny. I think, you know, we should talk about what needs to be done with him. And in that small moment, like his voice is kind of distorted. And while they're talking, you see it cuts to the shot of the the blood coming out of the elevator, and that scene always gives me goosebumps. Specifically, that instance in that entire scene is like my favorite little moment and throughout the whole film, where you just realize like, okay, we're kind of past that threshold of like, we're in sinister territory, like where maybe he has become possessed, and the hotel is almost coming alive through him.
Yeah, I think after that moment, the rest of the movie is probably like my favorite part of the movie. Just like that whole everything that ensues afterwards. It's just pure chaos and very thrilling to watch. And he becomes very terrifying because again, I think they show that he's kind of not a great guy throughout the movie. And when he becomes possessed, he just becomes even scarier.
You are concerned about him.
Yes.
And are you concerned about me?
Of course I am.
Of course you are. Have you ever thought about my responsibilities?
Oh, Dick, what are you talking about?
Have you ever had a single moment's thought about my responsibilities? Have you ever thought for a single solitary moment about my responsibilities to my employers? Has it ever occurred to you that I have agreed to look after the Overlook Hotel until May the 1st? Does it matter to you at all that the owners have placed their complete confidence and trust in me, and that I have signed a letter of agreement, a contract, in which I have accepted that responsibility? Do you have the slightest idea what a moral and ethical principle is? Do you?
Yeah, I don't have a favorite like moment. I think the scene where he talks to I think it's like a butler or like a server in the restaurant.
Yeah, that's all.
I don't know if it's like a favorite scene, but I love like the colors, like the use of red in that scene. From a technical standpoint, that's probably my most interesting scene, I think. But entertainment wise, probably just like the last like third of the movie.
I also want to give a shout out to like when he's in the ballroom, just alone talking to the bartender. That's I think also like a fantastic scene that's in the movie.
Okay, so I have not seen Doctor Sleep, but if you had any thoughts about that film without spoiling it, did you want to share them? Or if you haven't seen it, we can also move past it.
Yeah, I actually did end up watching Doctor Sleep last year.
Okay.
General thoughts, because I don't want to spoil it for you. I personally think it is not that great. This I guess is another hot take. I'm not a big Mike Flanagan fan. I know a lot of people are.
Okay, that is kind of a hot take.
Yeah. I mean, I've really tried. I really have tried.
Did you watch Haunting of Hill House?
Yep.
That one? I didn't like Blind Manor that much. So
I watched Haunting of Hill House.
I liked Midnight Mass though. I watched that recently.
Yeah. And it's kind of like I watched Hill House and Blind Manor, and I watched Doctor Sleep, and like Hill House, I could only get through like halfway through it. Same with Blind Manor. I think the main thing for me,
Blind Manor was kind of boring. I didn't really like it that much.
Yeah, I think the main thing for me is honestly, I don't think that his scripts are the strongest. They just feel a little fake to some extent. Like a lot of the dialogue feels like ham-fisted and forced and doesn't feel natural to me at times. That was like kind of my main complaint with like Hill House. And like that's why I kind of like it just kept bothering me. I was just like the dialogue in this is just like not great to me. Doctor Sleep, just going back to that though, that movie is in a weird spot because it's trying to be a faithful adaptation to the novel Doctor Sleep, but it's also trying to be a faithful adaptation to the novel The Shining, but also it's acknowledging the film The Shining. So it's just in this weird spot where it has to do this balancing act. And I think it kind of takes away from the mysticism of The Shining, and it gets like way too like applicable with like what The Shining is. Like The Shining, they use it as like almost like a superpower in that film, where like people are like literally like flying and like doing like all sorts of like crazy shit, and it's just like this, I don't know, it just really demystifies a lot of the beauty of like
the
lore of the Shining universe, I guess.
Yeah, well, I haven't seen it in this moment in time, but I'll let you know if I ever watch it and what I think, because I've heard kind of mixed things about it. Because again, I also heard that they were trying to like make a faithful adaptation of the book while also being a sequel to the movie, and I was like, that's going to be a tough act to follow, considering Stephen King like hates this movie. Yeah, and I never watched it, but I know Stephen King tried to do his own series at one point, and it never really took off. Like they made
like
it
a mini series,
but I heard it wasn't as good as the Kubrick film, which is unfortunate because I think I'm a big advocate of authors writing the scripts for the books they make. Like I'll give two examples of this. I recently watched, not recently watched, I recently read Perks of Being a Wallflower and Gone Girl, because both those films are like among my favorite films in the
Yeah,
last 10 years.
I love Perks of Being a
And I
Wallflower.
think the movie is better than the book for both. And I think it's because the author of the book had a hand in writing the script. Or actually, I think they only wrote the script. And I think they fully understood what it means to make a great book versus a movie. And I think the books are great too, obviously. They're awesome. But I think they did a really good job adapting their own stories for like the film medium. And I think in general, it'd be cool to see more of that if the author is like talented enough to write a script, because it's a different ballpark completely. Because the Perks of Being a Wallflower, the book is all just like a series of letters that he writes. Like in the movie, they show a little bit of that, but in the movie, it feels more like a coming of age typical movie, and I think it works better for what it's trying to do.
Yeah, and I think that like kind of just adding into that, I think it is also kind of once again like a fine balancing act, because some writers are just more akin to what is required out of us like adapting into a media, but I think the writer of the original novels can have a better understanding of the source material because they wrote it.
Yeah, for sure. Like they understand the themes, they know what they want to say about the story. And I mean, I think in general, when it comes to films, the script is the backbone of the story. If the script is not good, it's very likely the movie will not be good. And that's why when like working on my own short film, I was like, I'm not gonna even bother trying to shoot or cast this thing until like we know the script is good. And the writing process should take a long time. And it seems like with Kubrick, with how methodical he was, I don't think he even bothered starting even thinking about it until like the script was perfect. So yeah, for sure, just interesting way to look at it. You had mentioned that, which I had also read about this, that the movie was almost kind of like a misfire when it came out. People didn't really like it. Just looking at 1980 as a year for cinema, for me, this is a good movie. I think there are four films I've seen from this year currently that I think are better. So I wanted to name them real quick. So The Elephant Man, that's a great film, David Lynch. Airplane, comedy classic. I recently saw Ordinary People, which is actually the film that won Best Picture. Now I think that's a great Best Picture winner. It's a really sad and like moving story about also a family on the rocks, but there's just no supernatural stuff in it. It's just like a drama. It's like Hereditary minus like the demonic stuff at the end. But yeah, that's a great film, and obviously
kids getting decapitated. I
mean, there is the whole plot revolves around like there's like a family of four. One of their kids like kills themselves, and that happens all off screen. It's like movie starts, and the mom like loves that son more. Like it's pretty obvious. And it's just like the family coming to terms with that. It's a really, really good movie that like I had never heard of. And someone was like, "Have you seen Ordinary People?" And I was like, "No, I haven't." And I think it's an extraordinary movie that not many people talk about. Actually, a pretty well-deserved Best Picture win, except Empire Strikes Back came out that year too.
Yeah,
and that was the best movie of that year for me. But yeah, I like The Shining more than Raging Bull. That's the other big movie from that year. So yeah, those are some films I've seen from that year. I don't know. I like to track movies from every year because I'm very like methodical about that. But if there's any movies you want to talk about from 1980 or even just like the 80s.
I mean, specifically, I think the 80s in general were a golden era for movies. There's so many amazing films that come out. Specifically though, 1980, just talking about that year. I mean, I just pulled up a list of like films, so I'm just seeing if I can recognize them. I mean, just the ones I recognize. Airplane, fantastic. One of the best comedies of all time. Like absolutely hilarious.
Like one of the best parody movies ever made. So funny.
Yeah, it's so good. And I was not expecting that when I saw it. I was just like, one of my friends was just like, "Hey, this is really, really good." And I was like,
that's when we watched it in our college dorms, and it was just hilarious. It's so funny.
Can you fly this plane and land it?
Surely you can't be serious.
I am serious, and don't call me Shirley.
Yeah, I would honestly, though, in terms of like best film I've seen from 1980, it is probably like a toss up between this and Empire Strikes Back. Because Empire Strikes Back, I mean, best Star Wars film, one of the greatest films of all time.
One of the best sequels of all time.
Yeah, one of the best sequels of all time. I'd probably say, it's up there with like, Two Towers, Godfather Part 2, Dark Knight. Those are probably like all like off the top of my head, like the best sequels ever. So it's really kind of a toss up between, I would say, Empire Strikes Back and The Shining for me. Both fantastic films.
Yeah, for sure. And I haven't seen very many films from that year, but I definitely agree the 80s was a wild time for cinema. And I
Yeah,
think there was a mix of like serious movies that like revolutionized cinema and also like just cheesy, like fun movies.
a
And
lot
I
of pop
think,
culture,
yeah, pop culture,
importance coming from
like
that decade.
you may have noticed like with Stranger Things and like other movies, they're really trying to capture that 80s nostalgia feeling
Yeah.
in a lot of
Even like music,
movies.
music is kind of going through like this 80s run, like running it back to the 80s. There's a lot of 80s sounds coming out of like popular music nowadays, like
Yeah.
Blinding Lights, Levitating,
Mm.
just
Yeah, like
things
the
like
kind
that.
of that bouncy pop sound
Yeah.
for sure. So you mentioned it earlier, but like I wanted to ask you about the ending of this movie because I'm not fully sure of how I interpret it because it shows a picture of like Jack Nicholson on the
Yeah.
wall. So I
Yeah.
wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so kind of just going it's kind of, I guess, what I mentioned earlier was like I think it's kind of like that's almost like the hotel's like body count, almost like like if that's everyone that's kind of like succumbed to the hotels like kind of gets put into that photo. That's like my own personal interpretation of it, but I know I've seen different interpretations of like that's actually like Jack Nicholson's character is actually like a reincarnation of a previous caretaker, and this caretaker keeps getting reincarnated and killing people. That's another interpretation I just remember off the top of my head, but yeah, that first kind of thing that I just mentioned, that's kind of how I view it, my own personal take on it.
Yeah, I think that first one makes sense. Like just added into the photo, that would definitely
Yeah,
make sense of what's going on. But again, I think it's one of those open-ended endings that I actually like kind of like. It's different and doesn't really change the events in the story, but it might change the way you perceive certain events.
yeah.
So I think that's pretty cool in how it does that. Let's see. One of the questions we always like to ask on the show, it's kind of a hard question, but do you think anything in the movie could be changed to make it better, or do you think it's perfect the way it is? And both answers are completely fine.
So I mean, personally, like I'm always gonna like because on our show like we do like like ratings like 1 to 10, and to me there's no such thing as like quote unquote like a perfect film. um to me like something that reaches like 10 out of 10 or like something like masterpiece status is like something that is either like a benchmark for the genre or raise something that's just it's something like that, like it's a benchmark for whatever respective thing you want to put it into, like genre medium, um or it's pushing something forward, or it's like a staple of the genre, it's like a classic. So like The Shining, I think there's issues with it for sure, but I would give it like something like a 10 out of 10 because I think it is like I think it is like a benchmark for the horror genre, and I think it's like a standard, and it's been so influential. But I think there are issues with it. I mean, I think like specifically at the end, I think it is a little anticlimactic with like how he just kind of dies in the maze after losing track of Danny. If there's anything I would have changed, it would have been like maybe maybe a little bit of a different execution to that ending. That's what kind of comes off the top of my head, but that's probably the main thing that whenever I think about this film, like things that I would probably change.
Yeah, for me, I mean, I don't think this is a perfect movie. I think it's one of the most influential, without a
Yeah.
doubt. I think it's I think it's more creepy than scary. A lot of people say this is the
Yeah.
scariest movie ever made. I think that's a bit of a stretch. It's definitely creepy and uncomfortable, but I don't know if I would say like I'm not gonna lose sleep after watching The Shining. I don't know, just like doesn't scare me to that level. But also I think as I mentioned, I mean Shelley Duvall, I feel like her acting is hit or miss in some moments. But besides that, I think I liked watching it more the second time. I think it's a movie I'm more inclined to revisit after watching it again.
Yeah, it's
But yeah,
definitely a movie that it's definitely a grower to me, and I think what makes it you could probably like consider in conversation as like one of the scariest films ever is like, yeah, I don't think the movie itself, like while you're watching it, you're like, oh my god, like I'm like losing sleep over this, is so scary, but it's like I think
which
like I
is good.
said,
I don't want to watch something that's
yeah.
scary.
Yeah.
To be fair.
But yeah, I think like really thinking about the film afterwards, there's so many lingering questions, so much ambiguity. It's a movie that doesn't really leave your mind right away, and when you do think about it, it is unsettling. I think when you think about it more and more, and when you do rewatch it and you pick up new clues and new details and things like that, that's I think what kind of adds to its
I think it's a
scary
film that
factor.
it's one of those films that it's a lot of fun to analyze and discuss. It might not be the most entertaining movie in the world, but
Yeah.
it's a very solid one that there's a ton to unpack. And
Yeah.
the saying goes, they don't make them like this anymore, and it's just because they don't.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, definitely.
but yeah, for sure. Okay, so before getting to our final question, I wanted to ask you: Was there anything else you wanted to discuss, or do you have any questions for me?
Yeah, one thing I want to ask you is like, what's your interpretation of the events of the movie?
So, from what I understand, is that this family that's kind of on the rocks goes to this hotel, with the intention of like, the dad's gonna focus on like his writing, and they're like trying to get the son away from like society, I guess, because he's like acting kind of weird,
Yeah.
with his other voice or whatever he's doing. And I think being isolated in some kind of supernatural presence causes the dad to like become like murderous and like try to kill his family. But yeah, I think that's essentially what happens. And then I think with the ending photo, I'm not sure where I stand on that. I really like the idea of like uh someone they just appear in the photo after something happens. I think that makes sense to me with what's going on.
Mhm.
But I would say that's pretty much they go to the hotel, and over time the father like loses his mind and tries to kill his family.
Yeah. Do you think anything of him losing his mind has to do with like cabin fever, or do you think it's like purely supernatural?
I think there's a mix of both, because being isolated can make you crazy for sure. I mean,
Yeah.
I definitely can see why that played a part in it, but I think there's definitely something more sinister and supernatural at play too.
Yeah.
With the
I'm
visions they
I'm
keep
kind of the
having
same
with like,
camp.
yeah, with the two twins, which we haven't even mentioned, who just like pop in every now and then. Like,
Yeah. The axe murdered twins.
yeah. But yeah, that's how I would interpret it as of at this point in time. I might need to watch it again. And I don't know if watching Doctor Sleep will change my interpretation or not. So there's that as well. So our last question on the show is, if you had to convince someone to watch this movie, what would you tell them, or what's your sales pitch?
Oh yeah. I guess I would say it's like, if you're not someone that's like into horror films, like this is like Yash was saying, it's not like you're not going to lose sleep over this film, but I think it's a really you should watch it because one, it's obviously like such a staple of pop culture. There's so many relevant scenes that come from this film, but I think also it's a great showcase for Stanley Kubrick as a director. How ahead of the times he was. Just his, I feel like a lot of his style is really present in this film, and I think it's a great blueprint. And especially, I think just off that, if you're not a horror film fan, I think this is just a great film in its own regard, just worth watching. Just like the collapse of this family. There's a lot of ambiguity and things you can dive into, and not just like the making of this film, but just the film itself. It's very deep, like it's a rabbit hole of a film. But as a horror fan, I think if you're a horror fan, if you're probably like a big horror fan of movies coming out these days, I think this is a great film to watch because this is like almost like a really like a precursor or like a predecessor, really like laid the foundation for a lot of the great horror films coming out today. And I think that's one of the reasons why I love this film. I'm not a big horror fan, but like as a fan of the art of filmmaking and filmmaking in general, I think this film is like really important to the medium and just an entire genre. Which you can't say that about a lot of films. Where this film is like this really like this staple watch of an entire genre. So that's kind of, I guess, my pitch for the movie.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I would say something similar. I mean, it's very influential. It's a part of pop culture. You're going to catch a lot more references and other things if you watch this film.
Yeah.
I personally I'm a big fan of psychological horror films, and this is one that clearly influenced so many of them.
Yeah.
It has the right level of ambiguity, and like there's lots to discuss if you're really into that kind of thing. But if you just want to watch a movie, and I wouldn't say you should watch the movie casually. You should definitely like tune in and watch it. But there's a lot to analyze here, and it's entertaining, and it's really well directed. It's a movie that like it's one of those movies that everyone's seen. You kind of have to watch it if you haven't watched it, just to like have an opinion on it. There's so many of those films that have really, and a lot of Stanley Kubrick's films are just part of history at this point. And as someone who appreciates film and cinema, I think this is one of those movies that you can love it or hate it, but you should watch it at least once, maybe twice. So I would say it's
You'll definitely have an opinion on the film. Like I don't think anyone's gonna walk out of it and be like whatever.
Yeah, no one's gonna. You're gonna have a reaction to this film, whether it's positive or negative. You're gonna have some kind of. Your brain's gonna be working when you watch it. You're not gonna be like just. It's not like a mindless horror film.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's just a very unique story. Again, it's one of those movies that didn't necessarily follow the book well, but it made a movie that honestly more people talk about than the book. So
Yeah.
So I think that's really cool and interesting.
Wendy, I'm home.
We have reached the end of today's discussion on The Shining. I want to thank Arsal for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here. It was great being on here. Maybe we'll do this again. Definitely we'll, try to have you on Controller Cast. So fans of Cinema Convos, like look out for that, because it'll be a nice little cross collab.
Yeah,
it was
for
great.
sure. And I'll be linking Controller Cast this episode, so be on the lookout for that whenever you watch this.
Yeah.
And yeah, we'll definitely have you back. You sent us a pretty big list of movies you'd like to discuss, so we'll have you back for sure.
Yeah, it was great having a convo with another cinephile like you. Thanks, Yash.
Yeah, for sure. From all of us at Cinema Convos, thank you for listening. If you enjoy our show, give us a follow on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to stay up to date on new episodes, and we hope you tune in next time.